This may be a shot in the dark, however, I think the Lunarians have had their culture appropriated by the celestial dragons, meaning those who wear spacesuits or diving suit-like costumes with the bubble helmet. Because the interesting thing about the Lunarians is that we know that they can naturally produce fire. We also know that Lunarians can survive in any condition, and that goes in tandem with their ability to produce fire, because when the fire is burning, they are nearly invulnerable. However, that vulnerability is lost when the fire goes out. So I think perhaps in the past, whether they lived on the moon or on the red line, and we know based on various statements that they were perhaps kicked out of the red line by those who call themselves celestial dragons. But I think the bubble in question that the celestial dragons wear is originally for the protection of the flame that is produced upon the backs of the Lunarians. And I think they use this bubble to protect their flame in various conditions, like perhaps in space where there is no oxygen to burn, or perhaps the physics of oxygen are treated very differently. However, there are a few caveats to Aniru being in space. We know that you can get to space very easily, either via balloon or flying machine like the Arc Maxim, but in addition, we don't really know how the physiology of the winged race people of One Piece actually works when it comes to the vacuum of space, if space is a vacuum at all in One Piece, because we know that Birkins, like Aniru, Shandians, and Skypians once lived on the moon, and presumably the Lunarians did too. So it's very uncertain how space works in One Piece. However, seeing as how we don't see an open flame in Aniru's cover story, it's very likely that fire can't burn in space when it comes to One Piece. So with that being said, I'm of the belief that if Lunarians did live on the moon in space, it's very likely that they used these bubbles to preserve their flames. Therefore, the bubbles had a very practical purpose, which is why it's very interesting now in the use of the celestial dragons. It's just used for the pompous purpose of not breathing the same air as the supposed common folk. However, I am suggesting that the Lunarians use these bubbles to preserve their own flames and thus preserving their invulnerability. So with that being said too, we know that bubbles have flame preservation properties sometimes, because in the Straw Hat cover story during chapter 555, we see Nami hanging around with Harides, and he has some device in which has a bubble attached to it. Within that bubble, we have another bubble, and within that bubble, we have a live open flame. So that's quite interesting. What increases the interest of this situation even more is that Harides is a sky person, because he is a Birkin, and we find this out in a Vivid card. However, based on him not having any wings, he most likely held the office of deity in Burka before Aniru destroyed Burka. So, with that being said, this most likely too is the origin of the Mother Flame, because we find out at the end of Egghead that Vegapunk as a collective know who Harides is, and they know where Witheria is. And we know, oddly too, that Vegapunk is also responsible for creating Lunarian hybrids in the form of the Seraphim. So, keeping all of this in mind, I think the Celestial Dragons got the idea for using bubbles as helmets and their whole weird spacesuit diving suit deal from the Lunarians originally. The bubbles were used to preserve their flames and thus preserving their invulnerability, but I do think the style of dress in the form of these spacesuits did come from the Lunarians as well, because it's very likely that they are the ones who pioneered the voyage to the moon from the blue planet, most likely. So they concocted these styles of dress to protect themselves further. And you kind of see this in how King dresses, or Albert, because his whole getup is kind of similar in some regard to those of the celestial dragons, because you do see these weird circles and notches in his leather outfit that appear on the uniforms of celestial dragons. So that's why I'm of the belief that the two are similar. What also gives this away is that the frilly undershirt that he wears is framed in a way in which it would support a bubble if he had one, but instead it supports a mask because he's hiding his identity as a Lunarian from others, because Lunarians are wanted on the Blue Sea. So I could believe that this is a hint that the celestial dragons got their whole getup from Lunarians originally. But with that being said, if you are liking the content so far, hit the like button, followed by the subscribe button if you want to see more from me, and don't forget to click that bell. In addition, please click the hype button because it does help somehow. With that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's